1878, Louisiana, New Orleans. The city was like an open coffin, its lid slowly closing. A.M. Dr. Abraham Walker looked out the window of the Central Hospital in New Orleans. A yellowish, wet mist hung in the sky. The smell of the Mississippi River's mud and the distant smoke of damp, burning wood. This was the morning of New Orleans. But Abraham knew that hidden beneath this picturesque atmosphere was a silent killer. Abraham hadn't slept. He'd only managed 8 hours of sleep over the past 4 days, because in the last week, not a single person had died a natural death in the city. "Sir, 2 more cases." "The same way," whispered Nurse Louisa, her eyes brimming with fear. Abraham spun around quickly. "Where?" "In the French Quarter. One is a child, only 6. The other is an elderly man. Both have yellow skin and a high fever. They're vomiting blood, sir. That horrific yellow blood vomit." Abraham's heart pounded. This wasn't just a fever. This wasn't the plague. This was yellow fever, the disease that arrived at the end of summer, bleeding New Orleans dry every time. But this time, the situation was completely different. The last yellow fever outbreak was 5 years ago. The mortality rate then was low. This time, however, it had nearly reached 60%. And the most astonishing thing was that the majority of the infected were recently arrived Italian and Irish immigrants. Abraham looked at Louisa. "Do they have any African-American neighbors?" Louisa hesitated. "Yes, sir. Right next to the elderly man's house, a few families of freed slaves live in a small cottage, but none of them show any symptoms." A crease formed on Abraham's forehead. This was the riddle that had kept him awake night after night. Why was this killer only attacking white people, especially new immigrants from Europe? Why were people who had lived in Africa's warm climate for hundreds of years, or their descendants, almost completely immune to this disease? This question brought him face to face with a profound truth. This disease didn't just affect the body. It seemed to be the result of a complex equation involving history, slavery, and genetics. Abraham put on his hat and picked up his leather bag. He knew that today he had to work not only as a doctor, but as a secret investigator. He needed to find out, what was the source of this disease? Why could black people fight this disease while white people could not? The answers to these questions were hidden either in the mud and water of the Mississippi or in the deep silence of the African cottages. He stepped outside. As his carriage moved through the mist, he remembered that hundreds of white people had fled New Orleans in fear of the disease. But among those who remained, a toxic blend of fear and hatred had formed. They believed this was not their disease. It was a plague brought by others, Abraham sighed. Before him lay not just a disease, but America's racialized society, where a tiny mosquito had exposed a horrifying inequality of human history. His goal was not just to save people. His goal was to uncover the truth. A truth that lay hidden in the body's secret defense mechanisms and the climate of one's birthplace, even preceding the history of slavery in America. The carriage headed toward the French Quarter, where the yellow shadow of death had fallen. Dr. Abraham Walker arrived in the foul-smelling, congested alleyways of the French Quarter by horse-drawn carriage. The silence was like a tomb. The vibrant New Orleans that used to laugh, sing, and play jazz was now mute and deaf with yellow terror. Mystery in the lab Abraham quickly collected samples from the home of the recently deceased child. He knew that the common belief was that the disease spread through blood, vomit, and contaminated air. But Abraham's suspicions lay elsewhere. He was determined to confirm, why was this disease so easily victorious over white people, especially laborers and immigrants from Europe? It was deep night in the Central Hospital laboratory. Abraham sat before a microscope. On the table were various glass containers holding yellow vomit, blood, and the malaria tonic supplied by the colonial government. He looked through old medical reports borrowed from the library. In one report, he saw that during the slave trade, Many white merchants and ship captains died of yellow fever in the West Indies and Louisiana. But the African slaves they brought often survived. Why? Abraham's hypothesis. He knew that a gene abnormality, sickle cell anemia, provided partial protection against malaria in certain African populations. But yellow fever is not malaria, Abraham muttered. So, is there a microbe that builds the same defense against both diseases? His assistant, Benjamin, an African-American youth and son of a freed slave family, entered the lab. Benjamin was highly intelligent and Abraham's only reliable aide. "Benjamin, have you ever been infected with yellow fever?" Abraham asked. Benjamin shook his head. "No, sir. Neither have my parents. I had a fever when I was a child, but I never saw yellow vomit." Abraham looked intently at Benjamin. "What is inside your body that these people who arrived from Europe don't have?" The colonial conspiracy, meanwhile, rumors spread in the city that the disease was caused by African witchcraft. White council members began increasing surveillance in African-American neighborhoods. They claimed that black people were intentionally contaminating the water or spreading the disease. Abraham realized that his scientific inquiry was no longer limited to medicine. It was slowly becoming the center of political and social conflict. The head of the council, Mr. Hendricks, summoned Abraham. "Dr. Walker," Hendricks said in a cold voice, "stop your strange research on this disease. To save the city, we must convince the public that cleanliness is next to godliness. Black people are unclean, so seal off their areas." "That is the solution," Abraham protested. "Mr. Hendricks, your decision is not scientific. I have information that the source of the disease is not uncleanness, but an insect of a humid region. And the physical resistance of black people is much greater than that of Europeans. Sealing off their area will be an injustice to the wrong people." Hendricks frowned. "Are you suggesting they are racially superior?" "You, a man of science, are creating racist stories, Doctor." Abraham understood that revealing the truth would put him in danger. To say this in white society meant being ostracized, yet he did not back down. A new clue, the mosquito menace back in the lab, Abraham found an old Spanish document. It described a yellow fever outbreak in the Caribbean in the 1500s. It noted that before the fever began, the locals observed an increase in the number of small flying devils. Abraham's eyes lit up. "Mosquito!" He quickly turned to Benjamin. "Benjamin, have you noticed if there are more mosquitoes in the white people's areas, where there are many flower gardens and bushes? And are there fewer mosquitoes where many people like you live together?" Benjamin considered this. "Sir, our cottages are near the river, but we often clear out the mud and stagnant water at night. But the wealthy white homes have large tin drums to collect rainwater and beautiful ornamental pools." Abraham felt like he had found a small piece of his long search. He quickly caught a mosquito larva and looked at it under the microscope. "Benjamin," Abraham whispered, "this disease doesn't spread through the air, nor through dirty water. It is spread by this tiny killer. And because this disease originated in Africa, people of African descent have acquired the ability to fight against it over the years. Europeans who suddenly came to this climate are completely unprotected against this new disease." Abraham now faced two challenges: scientifically proving that the disease is mosquito-borne, overcoming the hatred of white society, and the politics of the colonial government to reveal this truth. He knew that if this truth were revealed, it would challenge the old notions of racism, slavery, and immigration policy in America. A single mosquito would expose a vast history of inequality. Benjamin's strategy Abraham took Benjamin to the wealthiest area of the city, the Garden District. Here stood the luxurious mansions of the elite white population, with their ornamental pools and lush gardens. These were the people who were dying first. Benjamin proposed an ancient African strategy. "Sir," Benjamin said, "my father used to say that when the air is still and humidity rises, these small insects multiply. In some villages in Africa, When people sleep, they cover themselves with thin cloth or nets. They believe bad spirits cannot enter at night. Abraham was struck. Are you talking about a mosquito net? Whatever the name, sir, it works. Abraham saw that this was a simple way to practically prove his scientific theory. He quickly went to a fabric merchant and bought the thinnest gauze cloth. Confrontation with the powerful Hendricks doctor. Abraham took his research findings straight to council head Mr. Hendricks's huge mansion. Abraham knew he had to demonstrate the effectiveness of his mosquito-borne theory before he could prove it scientifically. Mr. Hendricks, I have a way to protect your family, Abraham said directly. Hendricks was just preparing his wife for her funeral. There was not grief in his eyes, only intense rage. My wife died because of incompetent doctors like you, who waste time researching in dirty Negro ghettos, Hendricks thundered. There is only one solution. Quarantine the city and burn down those slums. No, Mr. Hendricks, your wife did not die from the air of that ghetto. She died from the bite of a type of mosquito that breeds in the stagnant water of your beautiful garden, Abraham stated firmly. Hendricks was deeply sarcastic. A mosquito? This tiny insect is destroying our advanced white civilization. You've gone mad, Walker. Now, what will you say? That your Negro assistant knows a charm to kill mosquitoes. Abraham, completely unfazed, placed the mosquito nets on the table. I want your servants to install these nets on all windows, doors, and over your family's beds. And where there is standing water around your house, we must pour kerosene. If this does not work, I will leave this city. Hendricks was about to throw him out, but there was a strange determination in Abraham's eyes. Besides, after his wife's death, he himself was cowering in fear. In a moment of weakness, he agreed. All right, Walker, install your ridiculous witches' nets. But if even one more person in my family falls ill from a mosquito bite, I will revoke your medical license and ensure your assistant is put in jail. The historic experiment, the next 3 weeks, marked a crucial chapter in New Orleans history. At Hendricks's mansion, Abraham and Benjamin secretly installed mosquito nets at every entrance and over every bed in the mansion. Benjamin explained to them how vital it was to use the nets at night. At the Negro cottages, Abraham went to Benjamin's community and showed them how to clear standing water. In some spots, he scattered copper powder, a method used in some ancient communities to purify water. In other areas, where permission to install nets was not granted, the death toll continued to rise. 3 weeks later, no one else in Mr. Hendricks's house fell ill. But in other wealthy areas of the city, where mosquito nets were not used, the death rate continued to climb. Abraham had irrefutable proof. Although he didn't tell Hendricks anything directly, his behavior changed. He understood that the smallest truth was more powerful than the biggest lie. Dr. Abraham then prepared his final report on the mosquito-borne theory. But he knew that a greater obstacle awaited him than scientific truth. How would American society accept this truth? Because this truth would prove that Africans, not Europeans, had a degree of inborn protection against the disease, once again questioning the moral foundation of slavery. The utter rejection of the Medical Council on a hot afternoon in September 1878. The city's wealthiest and most influential white doctors sat around a table for a special emergency session of the New Orleans Medical Council. In their eyes were disbelief, annoyance, and clear hostility. Abraham presented his research paper in a calm but firm voice. Gentlemen, the cause of yellow fever is not the air or dirty water. It is a tiny, domestic mosquito, especially one that bites during the day and breeds in stagnant, clear water, Abraham declared. He showed his data. In the mansions where mosquito nets were used and water sources were covered with kerosene, the infection rate was 0. The infection and death rates were highest in the humid and densely populated areas of European immigrants in the French Quarter. The study conducted on Benjamin's community, although they lived in the least clean part of the city, their disease resistance was astonishingly high. I believe, Abraham concluded, that people of African descent have acquired an innate shield against this disease due to their birthplace's climate and hundreds of years of evolution. They have gained the ability to survive the fight against malaria and similar tropical diseases, which people raised in Europe's climate do not possess. Abraham's final words had the effect of a bomb exploding in the hall. The silence was broken by loud shouts. The council president, Dr. Fox, himself the son of a wealthy slave owner, stood up, his face red with anger. "Dr. Walker," Fox thundered, "have you forgotten where you are? You are spreading the venom of racial superiority in a scientific meeting. Are you suggesting that those Negroes who worked for us as slaves are physically superior to white Americans?" Another senior doctor scoffed. "A mosquito? This city is dirty, but not mosquitoes. Yellow fever is the product of filth and poor morality. Accepting your theory means glorifying those Africans in the eyes of society, which is completely unfounded and dangerous to our social structure." Mr. Hendricks, who was secretly listening, slammed his hand on the table. "This is not just science. This is rebellion. Dr. Walker, you are spreading this rumor through your assistant, Benjamin. Your mosquito theory is rejected right now. The only solution to yellow fever is quarantine and surveillance of the unclean areas." Abraham's research was dismissed. He was publicly warned. The next morning, he was informed by the hospital management that he had been fired from his position at Central Hospital for creating social unrest and promoting unproven theories. The abduction of Benjamin. When a devastated Abraham returned to the lab, Benjamin was gone. On the table was a note. "Walker, you were busy with your witches' nets. Your assistant is now in my custody. If you do not stop telling the city your false theory, he will not see the sun again." Hendricks had carried out his threat. Abraham's heart broke. He had the scientific truth, but his hands were tied. Benjamin was not just an assistant. He was a partner in this discovery who had brought the silent knowledge of his community into the light of science. To save Benjamin, Abraham might have to flee the city or fight against Hendricks's hateful politics. The birth of the underground mission, Abraham realized he was no longer just a doctor. He was a revolutionary. He understood that the truth could not be revealed to the colonial government. He had to go directly to the people. At night, Abraham secretly headed toward New Orleans' oldest slave market area. Here, isolated from the mainstream of society, African Americans and Irish immigrants lived together, distrusting the government. He met Mary, an elderly African American midwife and folk healer who had served the sick for generations with voodoo and folk knowledge, Abraham told Mary everything about his discovery, the mosquito, the standing water, and Benjamin's abduction. Mary smiled calmly. "We knew that a long time ago, White Sahib. We call it the small blood-sucking devil. You've only found its name and tactics. We've been clearing the water for ages." Mary told Abraham about her underground network, a hidden group that helped New Orleans' most vulnerable and frightened people. The group included Mary, symbol of African knowledge and local influence; Paddy O'Brien, an Irish immigrant leader whose community was dying most from yellow fever. He deeply resented the government; Louisa, Abraham's nurse, who secretly helped him with medical supplies. Abraham handed his mosquito nets, kerosene, and scientific knowledge over to this secret group. Their goal: to defy the government's orders and go house to house, teaching people how to use mosquito nets and destroying the sources of standing water. This hidden campaign became the last hope to save New Orleans. Putting pressure on Hendricks. Abraham knew that Hendricks was very conscious of his public image. Abraham devised a bold plan to put pressure on him. He wrote an anonymous letter, arranging for it to reach the city's largest newspaper. The letter did not explicitly state that Hendricks had kidnapped Benjamin, but was written with extreme cunning. A powerful city councilor, who publicly blames the ghettos for yellow fever, is secretly hiding the assistant of a scientist who proved the disease is mosquito-borne. His goal is to prevent the truth of African resilience from being revealed. If the assistant is not released quickly, the truth about the secret mosquito net experiment conducted in the counselor's own home will be revealed, which will prove he secretly believes the mosquito theory himself. The next morning, the city was abuzz. People were surprised to learn that Hendricks, who had called the mosquito theory madness just a week ago, was secretly using mosquito nets himself. Doubt and distrust began to form among the public. A quiet panic arose among the white population. Was the government lying to them? Hendricks was terrified. He knew that if his hypocrisy were exposed, his political career would be over. The guerrilla war of science, with Hendricks silenced by fear, Abraham's underground mission began working quickly. Their efforts were a direct translation of scientific data into public education, net making and distribution. Under the leadership of Mary and Louisa, women began sewing cheap gauze cloth to create safe canopies. Benjamin went from slum to slum, teaching Irish and Italian immigrants hands-on how to use mosquito nets and how to tuck in their beds before sleeping. Destruction of sweet poison. Paddy O'Brien led his strong young men to identify places around the wealthy white mansions where large tin drums or beautiful ornamental pools collected rainwater. At night, they secretly poured out the water or covered it with kerosene. This was a direct rebellion against the government's quarantine policy. The silence of the yellow cloud. Within a couple of weeks, results began to appear. Where people were dying due to government quarantine and old treatments, like bloodletting, the infection rate began to decrease in the areas protected by the underground mission. The ordinary people, especially the immigrants and the poor, began to secretly understand that it was not their government, but a fired doctor and his African wizard assistant who were saving their lives. The rise of truth on the American stage. In early 1879, Abraham Walker and Benjamin traveled to Philadelphia to attend a major medical seminar. In his speech, Abraham presented New Orleans' experience in fighting yellow fever. He proved the role of the mosquito, the danger of stagnant water, and the effectiveness of mosquito nets. But the most important part was the discussion about the resistance of Benjamin's community. Abraham said directly, "Due to evolution and climatic pressure, people of African descent have been able to tolerate a disease that was a death sentence for European immigrants. This disease has shown us clearly that racial differences are meaningless in the face of the body and disease. Science does not depend on hatred or ignorance. Science depends on observation." This speech created a huge stir in American scientific and social circles. Although Abraham's theory was not immediately accepted, it forever changed the trajectory of yellow fever research. The story of Abraham and Benjamin proved that the fight for public health is inseparable from the fight for social justice.